But why horror? Welcome to Vanessa Jupiter's sitting room, and today I am talking about 6 horror movies that made me realize how much I like the genre. This is a list of horror movies that I watched when I was either a kid or a teenager that influenced in some way the way that I engage with horror movies nowadays. And starting off with Scream 2, the second Scream movie. Possibly the very first horror movie I ever watched in my entire life. And when I tell you how creeped out I was by the Ghostface mask, like when I was 7 or something, I would have nightmares about the Ghostface mask. And I think that part of the reason is that movie theater scene. To this day, that opening scene in the movie theater where Maureen is murdered in front of everybody because they think that it's some type of performance. Like, very few mainstream horror movie scenes put me more on edge than that one. I don't like how it makes me feel. I love it, but I don't like it. Next up, I want to talk about Halloween, the original one by John Carpenter, 1978. When I was 10 or 11, my father came home. It was October. Halloween is not a huge deal in Brazil, but he came home and had a DVD of Halloween, the movie, because he knew that I was going to throw this like small Halloween party with my friends. So he decided to bring this John Carpenter movie for us. We watched it. I really liked it. Halloween is so differently paced to what we are used to nowadays. So for me to have enjoyed it so much as a young kid is like kind of important for me and kind of special. And I think that the fact that I was exposed to Halloween so young is part of the reason why nowadays I still watch a lot of older horror movies. I think it's all a matter of exposure, really. Fun story. I would throw a Halloween party every year and I was the only kid in my school who did it, I think. And when I was 11 or 12, I was rewatching the 1978 movie for like the second or third time. And I told myself, maybe I should start watching like the subsequent Halloween movie each Halloween. So at some point, I'll have watched all of them. But then, 12-year-old self was like, no, that's a silly idea. Eventually, I'll grow out of horror movies. I won't like horror movies when I'm 20, and then it's a decade and a half later, and I created a YouTube channel mostly to talk about horror movies, so well, 11-year-old self, you should have gone with your idea of watching a Halloween movie every year. Yes, Halloween holds a very dear, special place in my heart, with all of its problems. Moving on, I became a teenager in the 2000s, therefore, I obviously watched the Saw movies. I'm very certain that I watched Saw 1 and 2 at least 10 times each. One of my favorite subgenres of horror is indeed body horror, gore, extreme violence. I just it just really works for me. And because I know it's fake, I can just like sit down, look at it, enjoy and relax. I forget about all of my problems and it soothes me. I just like seeing brutal depictions of violence on screen just soothes me so much. And here's the thing. I would always talk about like this distinction between movies that I like and movies that are actually good. Saw 2 would always be a movie that I like but is not actually good, whereas the first Saw was actually good. I don't like the distinction nowadays anymore. This is a really good segue into the next movie, which is Possession. Remember the thing that I mentioned about Halloween, how I thought that I was going to grow out of horror movies? That was kind of true for a little bit of my life. It's not like I ever gave up completely on the genre, but there was a period in my adolescence where I actually spent much more time watching European pretentious dramas rather than watching horror movies. Edit. I don't think that the movies that I watched were themselves necessarily pretentious, but I think that the way that I engaged with them considering them to be above other types of movies was a pretentious way of engaging with the movies. And while I was in that period of my life, I found Possession, which appealed to all of the sensibilities that I had for these pretentious movies, but it was also inarguably a horror film. That was the moment when I realized that horror movies could have a message and a theme. And to make this clear, I think that analysis of Saw, analysis of Halloween, and of Scream are just as valid, just as important as analysis of something like Possession. I don't think that one thing is better than the other by any means. Nowadays, I really begrudge this type of thinking of like, there's such a thing as a good movie. A good movie is just a movie that you enjoy. A good movie is just a movie that I enjoy. Without Possession, I am not sure if I would ever have accepted to go back into horror the way that I did, because I needed that bridge between the pretentious European dramas and the gory, absurd, intense horror movies. Possession was that bridge for me. The political background, themes, the acting, the drama, the horror, the monster, like everything about Possession is perfect to me. Next, number 5, Wreck. Wreck I watched much later in my adolescence. Between ages 12 and 20, it was really hard for me to find a movie that would actually scare me. I watched a lot of gore, I watched a lot of fun horror, but horror movies that actually scared me were so few, so far between, and I had kind of forgotten what it felt to be like scared by a movie until I watched Wreck. Oof. I really like found footage for the simple fact that when it's well made, it can make it so much easier to suspend your disbelief. And Wreck is the perfect example of that. I will never forget that moment when I was in the movie theater watching Wreck for the first time. And halfway through the movie, things had already gone completely off the rails in the narrative. Completely off the rails. It was outrageous what was happening on that screen. But somehow, my brain just said, the creepiest thing about all this is that it was all real. And then it took me 10 seconds to remember that I was watching a fictional narrative. Like, I don't remember having had that feeling about anything else besides Wreck, really. Even when I'm super immersed in a movie, I can still like remember that it's a movie, and Wreck made me forget for a while. And it's just so creepy. Like, and finally, number 6 is Martyrs. I probably was already 19 by the time that I watched Martyrs for the first time. Martyrs merges a couple of the things that I've already talked about in this list. It's creepy, it's torture porn, the gore and brutality in it is like off the rails. It's impossible to watch it without noticing the intellectual aspect of it. This is the real thing that I mean when I say that Possession is a different type of horror movie. It is possible to analyze Halloween and Scream in very interesting and engaging and important ways. But watching Possession, watching Martyrs, the analysis is pushed into the forefront. It's kind of impossible to watch a movie like Possession or Martyrs without realizing that there's more than meets the eye in them. And all movies have more than meets the eye, I think. But then Martyrs, like, it manages to be creepy, it manages to be body horror, it manages to be intelligent. And I love it for that. And it's also gay. I'm not sure if I had ever seen a horror movie that was explicitly queer before I watched Martyrs. It might have been the very first horror movie that I watched that had like gay characters. And that's exciting, that's important, and that's frustrating that it took me so long to find a horror movie with queer characters. Recapping, I started my horror movie journey with Scream 2, being terrified by Ghostface. Then I moved on to Halloween, and I thought that I was going to grow out of horror pretty quickly. And then I watched Saw, which made me get a taste for blood and gore. And indeed, I did grow out of horror movies a little bit for a couple of years, and I didn't care so much about them until I watched Possession, and it made me remember how much horror can be amazing. And then I watched Wreck, and I remembered everything about horror and about how creepy it can be to watch horror. And then I watched Martyrs, and I was like, horror can give me everything that I've ever wanted from any movie. It can be creepy, it can be gory, it can make me relax while making me think, and it can also be gay. So, this is a little bit of my journey with horror and movies that influenced it. This is why I talk mostly about horror in this channel, because I do care about it deeply. Love, Vanessa Jupiter.